Welcome back, everybody, to the studios of freshcatholic.com. I'm Charles Merritt, and this is our final episode of our ongoing series on the Ten Commandments. We're going to do the final two commandments today in this episode, the ninth and 10th commandment. And we're going to do two commandments in this episode for two reasons. Number one, the ninth and 10th commandments, both of them are pretty straightforward. And even though they are different commandments and they target different actions, they do revolve around the same theme, and that theme is covetousness or coveting. So because of that, I thought we would go ahead and do both commandments in this one final episode. The ninth commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or spouse, because it goes both ways. And the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. And of course, both of them revolve around covetingness or coveting. So with that said, let's back up a little bit and let's lay a little bit of groundwork on this whole notion of covetousness and coveting, and then we'll take that knowledge and we'll apply it first to the ninth commandment and then to the 10th commandment. And the first question we should ask is, why do we covet? Why are we subject to, why do we fall prey to covetousness? And the best answer to that, really the only answer to that, is we've got to go back to the beginning. We've got to go back to the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve, committed the original sin. And having done that, they left us with what's called a fallen human nature. Now, our human nature has three aspects to it. There's an intellect, there's a will, and there are the passions or the appetites. Now, before Adam and Eve committed original sin, their intellects were clear. They saw the good clearly. They understood the good clearly. Their wills were strong. They pursued the good easily. And their passions and their appetites were kept under control. They committed the original sin, and therefore, instead of passing on what they had to us, what they passed on was a fallen human nature, where our intellect now, rather than being clear and seeing the good clearly and understanding the good clearly, now our intellect is what's called cloudy. We don't see the good as clearly as we should. And sometimes we mistake evil for good and good for evil. So our intellect is cloudy. Our wills, rather than being strong and pursuing the good easily, now our wills are weak. And we struggle to pursue the good. We struggle to do the right thing. And our passions and our appetites, rather than being under control, now are unruly. And sometimes they rise up and they overpower our intellect, and we do something sinful or something wrong even before we realize we're doing it. So original sin leaves us with a fallen human nature, a cloudy intellect, a weakened will, and unruly passions or desires. This fallen human nature, in turn, with those three components, now we have a tendency or an inclination to sin. And in theology, that tendency to sin, that inclination to sin, is called concupiscence. And our concupiscence oftentimes takes the form of coveting or covetousness. We want things that we can't have. We want things that we shouldn't have. We want things that are not good for us. So in kind of retrospect, because we have that fallen human nature, we have a tendency or an inclination to sin, which is called concupiscence, and our concupiscence often takes the form of covetousness. And the two things we covet, the two broad categories of things we covet, we have a carnal covetousness, that's the ninth commandment, and we have a material covetousness, that's the 10th commandment. The ninth commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or spouse, a carnal coveting. The 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, a material covetousness. So the fact that the ninth and 10th commandment forbid the same thing, coveting or covetousness, it's a good idea for us to understand where this covetousness even comes from, why we have the tendency to covet. And we've just kind of taken a couple of minutes here on the front end of this episode to kind of review that. So with that in place, let's take the rest of this episode to look at the 9th commandment specifically, and then we'll look at the 10th commandment. Now, the 9th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, thy neighbor's spouse. Now, the Apostle John, now he wrote one of the 4 Gospels, the Gospel of John. He also wrote 3 separate letters, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And in 1 John, the Apostle John talks about this covetousness, this concupiscence we have, this tendency or inclination to sin. And he says that this covetousness, there's really, it's a 3-fold deal, okay? He calls it the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And incidentally, if we go back to Lent, we know that the 3 prescribed Lenten practices, fasting, almsgiving, and prayer, a lot of times people say, well, why those 3? Where does the church come up with those 3? And what significance do those 3 have? Well, the 3-fold Lenten practices, fasting, almsgiving, and prayer, match up with this 3-fold concupiscence, this 3-fold coveting. Because the lust of the flesh, the Lenten practice that targets that is fasting. The lust of the eyes, the Lenten practice that targets that is almsgiving. And the pride of life, the Lenten practice that targets that is a prayer. So not only are we left with this concupiscence, this covetousness, John in his first letter tells us this covetousness is a 3-fold deal. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life. Now the 9th commandment targets the lust of the flesh. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or spouse, right? So that's where we'll begin our look at the 9th commandment. Now, in terms of trying to, because the 9th commandment forbids us of doing that, what helps us avoid violating the 9th commandment? Well, in order not to run afoul of the 9th commandment, the first thing we have to have, and the primary thing we have to have, is what's called purity of heart. Because if we have purity of heart, if our hearts are pure, okay, the purer our hearts are, the more that helps us stay away from the covetousness that the 9th commandment forbids. So purity of heart is our best antidote, if you will, towards not violating the 9th commandment. Which begs the question, when we say purity of heart, what does that mean? What is a pure heart? What does a pure heart look like? Well, a pure heart aligns itself with the will of God. The pure heart wants God's will, not necessarily one's own will, okay? It wants what God wants. It desires what God desires. It values what God values. So purity of heart aligns itself with the will of God. And interestingly enough, this purity of heart is so important and so significant that Jesus talks about it twice in Scripture, okay? If we look at the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, which we find in its fullness in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus starts with the Beatitudes. And the 6th Beatitude specifically calls out purity of heart, because it says, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." So how important is purity of heart? And how significant is it in helping us avoid violating this ninth commandment? So significant that Jesus devotes one of the Beatitudes to it. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. And interestingly enough, if you look at all the Beatitudes, blessed are this, for they shall do this. The sixth Beatitude, the pure of heart, is the only one that references the vision of God. Okay? None of the other Beatitudes reference seeing God, the vision of God. It's the pure of heart that will see the vision of God, that will see God. That's how important that particular beatitude is. That's how important purity of heart is. So Jesus calls it out in the sixth beatitude. And then he also talks about the heart being the seat of evil thoughts, where he says, out of the heart come evil thoughts. And he gives a laundry list of them: adultery, envy, jealousy, murder, licentiousness. Okay? So since it's the heart that is the seat of potential evil actions, that underscores the importance of that heart being pure. That it underscores the importance of having purity of heart, a heart aligned with God. And why the heart, you might say? Well, the ancients looked at the heart as more than just an anatomical organ that pumps blood, right? For the ancients, the heart was the seat, the source of your moral character, your moral personality, okay? Everything you did, the source of it, be it good or evil, everything you did outwardly, the source of those outward actions find their source, their seat in the heart. That's why having a pure heart is so critical overall, and especially critical in helping us avoid violating this commandment. And again, purity of heart is a heart that aligns itself with the will of God. So now, when we're talking about purity of heart, we also have to kind of in a side fashion also talk about modesty, okay? Because having purity of heart, yes, it aligns itself with the will of God. That's what makes a heart pure, a heart that aligns itself with God's will. And if a heart is pure, if a heart does align itself with God's will, it'll look like certain things. It'll display certain things. And one of the things it displays is modesty, okay? Modesty in terms of not unveiling that which should stay veiled. Modesty in terms of the speech that we use, the actions we perform, the way we carry ourselves, how we dress. A pure heart it shows itself outwardly in modesty. A pure heart shows itself outwardly in chastity. And if you're practicing modesty, if you're modest, if you're practicing chastity, if you're chaste, okay, that will help you avoid violating the ninth commandment in all of its different forms. So when we're talking about the ninth commandment, the so-called carnal concupiscence or carnal coveting somebody else's spouse, okay, in order to avoid doing that, we have to have a heart aligned with God's will. We have to have purity of heart. And if we have purity of heart, that will manifest itself in us being modest, in us being chaste, and will help us avoid violating that ninth commandment. So that's the ninth commandment, and specifically what it calls out. The specific form of coveting where we carnally covet somebody else's spouse. Now the 10th commandment also addresses itself to this concupiscence, this covetousness, this coveting, but now it moves its spotlight from a carnal concupiscence to a material type concupiscence, where it says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. All right? Now, you might say, okay, coveting somebody else's goods, that might involve like theft or stealing or something like that. And yes, the end result of coveting somebody else's goods, if I covet Simon's goods, if that covetousness reaches full flower, so to speak, it'll wind up in me maybe stealing or taking or unjustly keeping Simon's goods, okay? But like with a lot of these other commandments, there's more to it than meets the eye, okay? Because again, let's go back to what we established at the beginning of this episode. Why do I covet at all? Whether it's a carnal type coveting or a material type coveting, I covet because I have a fallen human nature. My intellect is cloudy, my will is weak, and my passions or my appetites are unruly. And if they are so unruly that they rise up and they overpower my intellect, then I'm in a situation where if I see it and I want it, then I have to have it, okay? Whether I deserve it or not, whether it's mine or not, and whether that takes the form of stealing or keeping something unjustly, okay? So the fact that I'm coveting at all is because of my appetites have risen up and they're driving the train, so to speak, rather than my intellect. Now, if we're talking about material covetousness, which the 10th commandment is, we've got to talk about two things that are often confused, two things that people think are really the same thing, two things that are just, two different ways of basically saying the same thing. And that is jealousy and envy. Oftentimes people use those two terms interchangeably, but they're two completely different things, okay? If I'm envious, okay, envy is a disordered desire for the goods of another, all right? Disordered because they're not my goods. They are somebody else's goods. So envy is a disordered desire for somebody else's goods. And why do I have this disordered desire? Why do I have this envy? Because I covet. And why do I covet? Because my appetites have become unruly, all right? They've overpowered my intellect because of my fallen human nature. So envy is always in regards to somebody else's goods and wanting them. Jealousy is in regards to my goods. If I'm jealous, then I don't want you to have my goods. I want to keep my goods to myself. So again, just to make sure we're clear on this, envy, I want your goods. Jealousy, I want to keep my own goods. That's the difference, okay? And one of the biggest reasons why an individual falls prey and violates the 10th commandment, falls prey to this material covetousness, is because they are envious. And if you think about it, envy is, if you think about how much of an offense, violating any of the 10 commandments is a massive offense, a massive insult to God. But if we look at envy particularly, okay, think of how much of an insult or an offense it is to God. Because when I'm envious, when I want something that I don't have, what I'm really saying to God, if you think about this, what I'm really saying to God is, God, what you have blessed me with is not enough. I want more. I think you've shortchanged me, all right? I should have something I don't have. So when you envy something and you covet something, let alone go through with it and steal it or unjustly keep it, if you think about it, you're saying, God, of all the things you've blessed me with, it's not enough, all right? I deserve more. I want more, so I'm going to get that more. And if you think about it, telling God he hasn't blessed you enough, telling God that his provision is not sufficient for you, think of the insult or the offense to God that is. So again, if we're talking about material covetousness, which the 10th commandment targets, we've got to talk about and distinguish between envy and jealousy, okay? Now, the other thing about envy, all right, is that if I'm envious, not only am I in essence saying, God, what you've blessed me with, what you've provided me with is not sufficient, all right? And if I envy something and I carry through with it and I take it, that also violates love, the virtue of love, and the virtue of justice. Because in carrying out my envy and actually taking somebody else's goods, okay, that's not loving that person. That's not being just to that person. So this whole concept of envy, which is a big part of this 10th commandment, envy drives us to violate the 10th commandment. It also drives us to violate the virtues of charity or love and justice. So this whole thing of envy, and again, if I'm envious, all right, that also, if you think about it, it touches on me not being humble. It kind of cuts into my humility because, in acknowledging that God knows not necessarily what I want, but God knows what I need, and He always provides what I need in the amount I need it, in the fashion I need it, when I need it. The acknowledgement of that, okay, in order to acknowledge that God knows better than me what I need, I've got to be humble. And if I'm envious and if I tell God, you got it wrong, I need more than what you provided me with, okay, that goes against humility. So this business of envy violates the 10th commandment, violates the virtue of love, violates the virtue of justice, and it attacks the virtue of humility, right? So this 10th commandment and kind of the major component of it, envy, that's a big deal, all right? And it's a big, underscoring how big a deal of it is, going back to those evil actions that come out of an impure heart. Two of the things that Jesus targets are jealousy and envy, all right? Now, in addition to what we've already said about the 10th commandment and envy, we should also mention, in our discussion of the 10th commandment and in violating it, greed, or what was called avarice back in the day. And if we were to define what greed is the desire, the disordered desire to amass earthly goods without limit, to acquire more and more and more goods for the sake of acquiring them, far beyond what we need. And of course, if we're engaging in greed, if we have that disordered desire to amass earthly goods without limit, obviously that's violating the 10th commandment. And Jesus targets this as well when he talks about the rich young fool who is building more and more barns to store more and more of his goods. And he says to himself, I've got so many goods now, I can take my ease, I can eat, drink, and be merry. And Jesus calls him a fool and says, tonight your life will be required of you, and whose goods will they be? So the whole encounter with the rich young man or the rich young fool revolves around avarice or greed and amassing earthly goods without limit. So if I'm envious, definitely. If I'm greedy, definitely. And then another thing we should mention that would violate this commandment is if I harm somebody else in their goods. All right? Because if I'm envious or if I'm greedy, my envy and my greed, if it were to go full flower, as we say, oftentimes results in stealing and theft. But it doesn't necessarily have to just result in stealing and theft, okay? My envy and my greed could also manifest itself, could also take the form of harming somebody else in their goods. So suppose, we're in a studio and Simon has all of this highly technical equipment. He's got monitors and soundboards and lighting and cameras. And suppose I'm envious of those, okay? Well, one of the things that I can do because I'm envious of those is I could steal them, okay? And acquire them for myself. But in my envy, I say to myself, you know something, I'm envious of those goods. I don't think Simon deserves them because I don't like Simon. But what am I going to do with all this equipment? I don't know how to operate it. I don't have room to store it. So my envy against Simon and his goods might not take the form of stealing them. It might take the form of damaging them, okay? So I damage the lights, I damage the camera, I damage the sounding board, right? I send a virus to all of these computers and monitors, okay? Because I'm envious of Simon having them. I don't want him to have them because I don't think he deserves to have them. I don't necessarily want them, but I don't want him to have them, so I decide to damage him as well. So harming another person in and through their goods also violates this commandment. And we should also say one more thing while we're talking about this commandment before we kind of summarize, and that is that another way that this could take shape, take form, another way it could look is, let's say you're a merchant, let's say you're a business owner, right? And you have a disordered desire that goods become scarcer and scarcer and scarcer, because that's going to drive up prices and that's going to allow you to make more profit, okay? Without any compassion or empathy on the hardship that creates everybody else, all right? Or let's say you're a physician and you secretly desire, it's disordered obviously, you secretly desire that disease spread, okay, so that you can treat more patients, perform more surgeries, and make more money for yourself, okay? So those are some additional ways this envy, or in this case, this greed, would look like, could take shape, and could obviously violate the 10th commandment. So I wanted to mention those additional things as well. So now let's see if we can kind of pull everything together and bring this in for a landing. Commandment as just that main commandment. Hopefully we've gotten a better feel for, certainly a better understanding and appreciation for the fact that each of those primary commandments, when we kind of dig into them, have a lot of different components, a lot of different aspects, a lot of different levels, okay? And then when we kind of open our lens, open the aperture on each one, they expand out. So if we walk away from this series with anything, Hopefully, it's the understanding of and appreciation for these 10 commandments cover a lot of ground, maybe more ground than we thought they did coming into this series, okay? And now coming out of the series, and we see the depth and the width that each of these commandments cover. If we do use them as part of our examination of conscience, now we'll have a fuller examination of conscience, and that's only to our good. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode, wrap up this series. I thank you for hanging. It was a long series because it was 10 commandments, but hopefully you've gone through the whole series, and hopefully, like I said, you have that better understanding of and appreciation for the 10 commandments. So having said that, I thank you for supporting Fresh Catholic. Thank you for supporting this series. And until our next series, I'm Charles Merritt. Take care and God bless.